CPI chapter. And sorry I ended things a little quickly on that part one. I hit a slide that was not intended for the online portion. Anyway, so now that we've looked at calculating the CPI, what is in the CPI's basket? You can see here that the largest slice, 42%, is housing, 17% is transportation, 15% is food and beverages, 6% is medical care, 6% is recreation, 6% is education, 4% is apparel, and others. So by far, the largest slice is housing. Okay, now we're going to look at some of the problems with the CPI measure itself. And actually, there are quite a few problems. So let's go to first one, substitution bias. Over time, some prices rise faster than others. Consumers substitute towards goods that become relatively cheaper. The CPI misses the substitution because it uses a fixed basket of goods. Thus, the CPI overstates increases in the cost of living. So in other words, consumers look for a deal, and the consumer price index misses that consumer substitution from more expensive to cheaper. Here's another problem, introduction of new goods. When new goods become available, variety increases, allowing consumers to find products that more closely meet their needs. This has an effect of making each dollar more valuable. In other words, a dollar is buying a good that is more meeting consumer needs, like an iPod or the iPhone, or God forbid the iPad that a lot of people are using for their Apples now, Apple computer that is. The CPI misses this effect because it uses a fixed basket of goods. Thus again, the CPI overstates increases in the cost of living. Okay. Unmeasured quality change. Improvement in the quality of goods in the basket increased the value of each dollar. The BLS tries to account for quality changes but probably misses some quality improvement, so quality is hard to measure. Thus, the CPI overstates increases in the cost of living. Each of these problems causes the CPI to overstate the cost of living increases. The BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, has made technical adjustments, but the CPI probably still overstates inflation by about 5% a year. This is important because Social Security payments and many contracts have COLAs, cost of living adjustments, tied to the CPI. So even though the CPI overstates inflation, I think those who are getting COLAs or their salaries tied to the CPI probably don't mind that it overstates inflation. In other words, it's a little bit more money than they would be getting otherwise. The people who are losing out, though, are the taxpayer because of the overstatement of the CPI. Okay, now let's compare the CPI and the GDP deflator. Okay, so we looked at the GDP deflator in the last chapter, and now we're looking at the CPI. And here's the two. They roughly move in the same direction, but it sure looks like from here that the CPI, shall we say, is a bit more volatile than the GDP deflator. Let's look at some of the differences between the CPI and the GDP deflator. Imported consumer goods. So these are goods that are imported from other countries. It's included in the CPI because that's what consumers buy, but it's excluded from the GDP deflator because it's not produced in this country. Capital goods, excluded from the CPI because it's not a part of the consumer market basket. Included in the GDP deflator because it's something that's produced in this country, if it's produced domestically. CPI uses a fixed basket. GDP deflator uses a basket of currently produced goods and services. This matters if different prices are changing by different amounts. So there are some big differences. From a statistical standpoint, probably the GDP deflator would be better, but the CPI still looks at what consumers are actually buying, and certainly they're buying imported goods. So I guess we're sticking with the CPI, even though there are some issues with its measurement. All right, let's look at another use for the CPI, and that is correcting variables for inflation, comparing dollar figures from different times. Inflation makes it harder to compare dollar amounts from different times. We can use the CPI to adjust figures so that they can be compared. In other words, what a dollar bought 30 years ago was a lot more than what a dollar buys today, and that is primarily because of inflation. The purchasing power of the dollar has gone down. So let's look at an example. Price of regular unleaded gas in 1981 was $1.42, and in 2005 it was $2.50. To compare these figures, we will use the CPI to express the 1981 gas price in 2005 dollars. What gas in 1981 would have cost if the cost of living were the same then as in 2005. So, in other words, we're going to keep the dollars, the purchasing power of the dollars, constant and see what the true gas price was in, let's say, 2005 dollars. So either we could do it in 1981 dollars or in 2005 dollars. Okay, and the formula is we multiply the 1981 gas price by the ratio of the CPI in 2005 to the CPI in 1981. If we wanted to go backwards, we would multiply the 2005 gas price by the ratio of the CPI for 81 to the ratio of the CPI for 2005. Okay, so here's our prices, and there's the CPI right here, right there. And the 1981 gas price in 2005 dollars is $3.15. So is that more than 1981? Most certainly is. Actually, was it more in 1981 than in 2005? Most certainly is. If you take the 1981 gas prices and make them into 2005 dollars, then you're comparing the $2.50 in 2005 to $3.15 for 1981. So that's a way to use the CPI to correct for dollar figures from different times. Now we can also correct for inflation. A dollar amount is indexed for inflation if it is automatically corrected for inflation by a law or a contract. For example, the increase in the CPI automatically determines the COLA, cost of labor adjustment, and adjustments in Social Security. So if inflation goes up, these go up, and the person the recipient would be making more money, accounting for the decline in the purchasing power. Now, as I've said earlier in the chapter, number one, this is happening in fewer and fewer cases, and the issue now in summer 2010 is actually deflation, not inflation. Now we can also correct interest rates for inflation, looking at the nominal interest rate, which is not corrected for inflation. And this is the rate of growth of a dollar value of a deposit or debt. The real interest rate is corrected, and it's the rate of growth in the purchasing power of the dollar of a deposit or debt. And the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus inflation. So now we are doing a minus since we're dealing with rates as opposed to division when we're dealing with actual amounts. And here's an example. We deposit 1,000 for 1 year. The nominal interest rate is 9%. Inflation was 3.5%. And the real interest rate would be 5.5%. So the purchasing power of the $1,000 deposit has grown 5.5%. In recent years, the nominal interest rate was certainly a lot less than 9%. And if inflation rate was positive, you were actually losing money by keeping your money in the bank. That's something to keep in mind. Okay, we're just about finished with this chapter. Chapter summary. Consumer Price Index is a measure of the cost of living. The CPI tracks the cost of a typical consumer's basket of goods and services. The CPI is used to make cost of living adjustments and to correct variables for the effects of inflation. And the real interest rate is corrected for inflation and computed by subtracting the inflation rate from